Hello, listeners. Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are listening to the Nighttime Podcast.
Hello, listeners. This story is going to take us to the town of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. With a population hovering just below 10,000 people, Bridgewater is known by its residents as much for its role as the region's commercial center as it is for its access to natural resources. Being surrounded on all sides by lakes, rivers, and forests, Bridgewater has a lot to offer. But like many other unfortunate towns, Bridgewater too is widely known as the setting for a tragedy. The story we're about to hear involves what, for most, is an unthinkable crime. Penny Boudreau fears her 12-year-old daughter Karissa is going to step in the way of a romantic relationship that Penny seems to value above everything else. And as this story progresses, it's going to be painfully clear the lengths Penny is willing to go to save it. Tonight, in this episode of Nighttime, I'll be joined by Sherri Aikenhead to discuss her best-selling book, Mommy Don't, and the case that it covers, the murder of Karissa Boudreau.
Karissa, we love you. Your grandparents are looking for you. All of us are. I don't know where you are, but just come home or call or something, please. We're all worried. We just want you home safe. It's not like we're gonna get mad. We just want you home safe. Please.
Sherri, I'm so excited to talk to you about your book, about this case, and everything in between. But before we get into all that, let's start with you. This is our first time meeting. Tell me a bit about Sherri Aikenhead. Where are you from? What led you to this?
Well, I'm a small town girl from Fall River, Nova Scotia. I went to King's Journalism School in Halifax, and right away I got hired in Toronto by the news magazine Maclean's.
Oh.
Yeah, and I was a staff writer there, and for 20 years I kind of crisscrossed the country doing journalism, Edmonton Journal out in Alberta. Then, like a good Maritimer, came home when I started having children and worked at the Daily News in Halifax. So I was the managing editor there. Had a great end of my journalism career, and then I went into government communications.
Oh, wow. Okay. I guess it's not a big departure to go from journalism to government communications, I guess. Would it be?
Not really, because you're still working with the media and trying to make sure, that the story gets out and the facts get out.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely it's in my blood. I know what a good story is, and I love storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Always have.
And now that you've ended your career in journalism, doesn't seem like you really have, because we're here talking about a book you just released, I believe just weeks ago it had come out. Before we get into the book though, you're retiring. Why did you decide, instead of spending all your time in the garden, spending all of your time writing and researching this case in particular? What led to you writing this book?
Well, I've been working on it for 4 years. Started researching pre-COVID, but it's a great question. I was in government 15 years, and I was working in the Department of Justice for Nova Scotia. And in that role, like in communications, you work with the media, you follow the big cases that are, of course, justice related. This one really grabbed me, I have to say. The day that I was down in Bridgewater in my role as a communications director, I sat in the court the day that Penny was coming in. So I sat in those court benches along with the family and hundreds of others. As a mother of 3 boys, I just felt sick. And I thought, I drove back to the city after all the interviews with all people were done, and went to my colleague in Halifax at the Department of Justice, and I said, I'm going to write a book about this someday. That was 15 years ago.
Wow. So this has been something that's been on, you say you've been working on it 4 years, but it took quite a bit of marinating before you even put pen to paper. Were you I guess you were following it closely as it was proceeding from that point on with the plan to eventually write it, or
Honestly, my motivation was really to make sure that the 12-year-old girl who was in the headlines, in this horrific rare crime, I just wanted her to be more than a statistic. Like Karissa Boudreau, from what I saw on the TV coverage and everything, this was a really wonderful, full of potential child. And day-to-day media, you may not realize that. And I just wanted her, I guess, memory to pay tribute to who was she,
Mhm.
as much as who was Penny in the horrible crime.
Mhm. And we'll get into the horrible crime, but as far as the book, Mommy Don't, you tell the story of the crime and the, I guess trial is not the right word, but like kind of the legal proceedings that happened after it. But you also spend an incredible amount of time providing biographical information about both Penny and Karissa and, all the people connected to them. So I think just in your explanation there that you wanted to honor Carissa's memory. I can see that now in the book because you do spend. I've learned a lot more about her through your book than I ever did
Oh,
from the years of news reports. Maybe before we get into the story, give me an idea of the sort of research you've done into the book to put this story together and to learn all these details about the lives of the people in the book.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, Jordan, because that was my goal. And my journalism background, I decided to try to interview everyone I could and really go back into when Carissa was born, who was her family, who was Penny, who influenced, how did this story come to happen.
Mhm.
Um, and I did 25 interviews over those 3 years. Uh, and they were tough interviews, I mean, I appreciated that every time I'd call someone, it might be traumatic. Like, why is this person calling me? But ultimately, when I went and saw people and sat down and talked to them, friends of Carissa's, three of them who were only 12 at this time, they trusted me and opened up to me. Carissa's aunt, she had never done a big interview, and yet somehow I really got to know some of these people, and I feel it really helped, shed light on Penny Boudreau, Karissa, and why did this story capture us so much in that town?
One of the things that really come out in the very first pages of the book, to be honest, is that Carissa was being raised in a rather complicated family dynamic. It wasn't. I don't think. I think it's fair to say it wasn't a traditional kind of family structure that this crime happened in. Give me a bit of like maybe to help contextualize the crime. Give me an idea of Carissa's family and the living situation at the time that this happens.
Oh, for sure. This story takes place in rural Nova Scotia. And I mean, it's a small province, there's many small towns. Um, and Penny Boudreau, the mom, she grew up on a little island, Cape Sable Island, where, the population is like 900
Hmm.
maximum. It's a fishing village, and so when she was old enough, she of course she wanted a boyfriend and got off the island. And at the local Sobeys, she met Paul Boudreau, and within months, she became pregnant and was going to have the child, Carissa. Well, when Chris was born, Penny then started dating almost immediately, moved in with Paul's younger brother, Shane. And so, I mean, that's unusual. But by all accounts, they managed through it. And Shane and Penny raised Carissa, and Paul was also involved. So, that's an unusual dynamic. Um, I also found note that Penny's own mom had killed herself, committed suicide when Penny was 11. So there's a lot going on there in this, young woman. Um, and she marries Shane. They raise Carissa. The grandparents are all involved. Very loving girl. Like Karissa is very spunky, very loyal, sweet, sweet child who, it's blended family. So
Mhm.
she's spending time with her dad, she's spending time with her mom and Shane and with her grandparents. Very religious family too. Um, Going to Bible school. Um, so yeah, it was unusual, but everyone by every indication, that child was, Chris was very loved. She loved her aunts, her uncles, everyone.
Mhm. And then something else would change. So that what you've described so far, this with this blended family, leading up to the crime that would end Chris's life, there was another change where Penny left the man, one of the men who raised Carissa, and was living with another man. And Carissa
Yeah,
was between the two homes. Can you kind of
yeah,
explain that point in Carissa's life and what led to her actually moving in with Penny?
sure. So, Carissa was spending summers with her biological dad, Paul, still visiting, living with Shane and Penny near Bridgewater.
Mhm.
But eventually, Penny broke up with Shane and left him. This really upset Carissa. She was very close to Shane. I guess we would say her stepfather. Um, and within she gets angry and she says, "I'm gonna," she'll move in with her dad in Shelburne. Meanwhile, Penny has met this gentleman named Vernon McCumber at the Atlantic Superstore in Bridgewater, and he's stocking shelves, and she's a cashier. And within 6 months, they move in together.
Hmm.
So now Penny is with Vernon, and Carissa's having a little trouble with living at her dad's place, and says, "Could I move back in with mom?" But when she moves back in with mom, she moves into an apartment in a 3-story building with paper thin walls. It's tight, it's cramped. It's not the nice home she lived in with Shane and Penny, and she's angry about this. Now she's got this other man in her life that her mom's with and seems to care an awful lot about.
Mhm.
It doesn't go well.
Mhm. And now, in the story, a lot is said about Penny and Carissa's relationship and kind of the problems they were having at this point. But I've never really seen why, or seen an explanation as to why Carissa decided to leave her dad's house to go with Penny. You just mentioned there that there was some conflict between Carissa and her dad, but I haven't seen much said or written about that. Do you have any
No.
background on why she left?
Yeah. No, it wasn't actually between her and her dad, Paul. They had a great relationship. They would go camping, go to the movies, but he had a girlfriend.
Okay.
So, um, that's by all accounts, that seems to be in Carissa's diaries. She wanted to be with her mom.
Mhm.
One of the most interesting interviews was actually with Shane and Paul's mother. So this is the mom, Suzanne Greer, who's a librarian, very well respected in little town Shelburne, and it's her boys, that were living with Penny. And Carissa goes to her and says, Nanny, I think I should go be with mom. And those conversations with Paul and her nanny, they could understand why a girl at 12 would want to be with her mom.
Mhm.
But it's something that I'm sure haunts Paul to this day, and he says so. And it also haunted Suzanne. She told me that when I interviewed her. She's since passed, but
Oh.
this really played on her mind too. So it wasn't, I mean, I think it's kind of normal that a child would, change her mind. She's 12, almost 13.
Mhm.
I think people can relate to that, but yeah, she wasn't there very long. She moved in November 2007 with Vernon and Penny.
Now, when Carissa moves in with Vernon and Penny, you described she needed to adapt a little bit to leaving an actual like standalone home with a yard and such to being in a smaller apartment with a whole lot less privacy. I don't know if it's just that or also the dynamic between Carissa and Penny, but it seems like they weren't mixing well at all when Carissa moved in. Can you talk about Carissa's time living with Penny and
Yeah.
Vernon and what problems they were having?
Sure. We know what problems they're having because we've seen Carissa's diaries.
Mhm.
And in her diaries, she talks about, I'm mad because I don't have, I miss Shane. I don't have the backyard. Um, I'm upset because mom, she can't relate to mom. Mom has these strict hours. I mean, in many ways, think of it. She was, when you're turning 13 and a young girl, there's all kinds of that angst.
Mhm.
But she really um, feels angry about the living situation. And not just cramped up, but that, they're really keeping an eye on her, and they're fighting a lot. They're yelling a lot. Carissa and Penny are clearly in conflict. And I'm sure a lot of moms can relate to that, but this was really getting on Vernon's nerves. It was bothering him because he'd come up the stairs and hear hollering and yelling, and yeah, it wasn't a great situation.
Mhm. And it seems like, at least from Vernon's point of view, publicly, it was something needed to be done to quash the beef between Carissa and Penny. And it sounded like, and this is going to lead up to the point where we'll discuss Carissa's disappearance. But the original plan, according to Penny, was to have some time alone with Carissa for a drive and a talk. This was the version of the story we heard in the media initially when this was a missing persons case. Is that this whole event starts with a mother
Yeah,
and daughter going for a long drive to maybe set some boundaries and try to kind of reset the relationship.
yeah. So, Vern says according to Vern, he says, you need to have a powwow. You need to go out and talk it out. So you're right. I mean, on the surface, and I'll call this the lie, it's a Sunday afternoon. And Penny says, let's go for a talk, just you and me. Vernon says, want me to come? No, no, you have a nap. We're going, just us girls. So they drive in her little neon car out to Lunenburg, which is about 20 minutes away. It's a beautiful town on the Atlantic Ocean. And, Penny's suggesting that maybe they need a counselor. And Carissa doesn't want that, Kids are kids. I don't need a counselor. I mean, it's pretty young to be getting into counseling.
Mhm.
So she kind of refuses and pushes back. And they get into it the whole way along, I guess, arguing a little bit more. And Penny's frustrated. Carissa's frustrated. She says, just let me be a kid, and adults are adults. You should act like an adult. I mean, this stuff goes on in the car. Well, then Penny pulls into the Sobeys in Bridgewater. They get back to town. And she says, I'm going to go get some groceries, pick up two things, some bacon, some mango juice before the storm comes. A big winter storm's coming. So she goes into the Sobeys. Carissa doesn't want to come. And she's in there less than 5 minutes, and she's walking out the doors and sees the car is empty. So she says, she calls Fern. She uses the payphone. This is 2008. There weren't a lot of cell phones like there are today. She uses the payphone and she tries to get Fern to say, oh my gosh, Carissa's gone. And she thinks she just maybe left in a huff. But she leaves a voicemail. And she calls and leaves another voicemail because Vern's sleeping away. It's Sunday, 6 o'clock. And she gets back in her car and she can't see Carissa anywhere. And so she starts driving around town looking for her. Carissa's only wearing pink Crocs on her feet, and she's only got a vest on. So maybe she headed home on foot. But when Penny gets back to home, Carissa's not there.
Mhm. And that's, of course, this is one of the versions of this story. So eventually, Penny contacts the police to notify them of. Initially, I guess it's told as sort of a runaway slash missing person. Penny's story is just as you said there. They got in a fight in the car. When Penny went into the grocery store, it seems that Carissa took off. When a 12-year-old is reported to police as like a runaway, I'm sure they get that call a lot, and it's probably not something where it's like an all hands on deck investigation initially. But when I read about this story, it seems like they took Carissa's disappearance seriously right from the get go. Was other than her being underdressed for the weather, do you know of any other reason why it seemed to really pick up steam quickly?
Oh, sure. I mean, Sergeant Al Cunningham, he's lived in this town his whole life. Um, there's never a murder there in 15 years. It's a small Bridgewater, 8,500 people.
Mhm,
It's snowing, it's awful. I mean, you're right. I mean, in most cases, 24 hours.
mhm,
But he felt worried for this child. And when he talked to the mom, maybe something went off a little bit in his head that, is this, I'm worried about this. This mother keeps talking about this child by her and she and it at one point. And
mhm,
like, I don't know. He looks back now and says he really did have some hairs raised.
mhm.
So he takes it very seriously. He searches till 3 a.m. in the morning before he calls it off. And he's a great cop, in a small town. This just never happens.
Mhm. And it very quickly becomes a major story, the search for the missing 12-year-old Karissa Boudreau. This within days is all over the news, posters all over the town. Can you tell me what you've learned or even what you've experienced during the time that it was being as a missing persons case? And what theories were there? Like as they couldn't find her and the days stretched on, what did people think were happening here?
Look, I was watching it on TV.
Mhm,
It was horrifying. I mean, um, I think because it is such a little small town,
mhm,
and Penny goes on TV and talks about it. Maybe
mm,
we'll get into that, but people were afraid. Like, had she been kidnapped? Was there some kind of like sex ring going on? Like, how could this happen
mm,
in Nova Scotia? And there's Amber Alerts. Child Find comes in, and it starts to expand into the U.S. across the border and into New Brunswick. The search for Carissa. People are leaving like their lunch breaks and going along the LaHave riverbank that runs through Bridgewater. People were just really invested. I mean, the parents were scared. They were driving their kids to school and sports. Um, and me just watching on TV as a mom, I felt invested too.
mhm,
It's like she's got to show up. I mean, one of the theories was that the river was partially frozen, and had she tried to get home across the river and fallen in and drown. And so I think most people suspected that. Um, and when the river thawed over the next week or so, the divers went down. There were helicopter searches all over the area. It was pretty dramatic in the middle of January in 2008,
mm,
and yeah, so hundreds of people became involved,
mhm,
uh, except for Penny. Penny
mm,
mostly stayed in her apartment, the mom, and this struck people as a bit odd, but thought maybe she's so afraid that, hoping that she'll walk through the door and come home.
mhm.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely touched off some suspicions, and Penny says maybe I should go on TV, try to
Mm.
find her.
Yeah, so Penny, Carissa's mom, Penny, not directly involved in the searches that have um, volunteers from all over who are taking part in searching for Carissa. Odd that Penny's not involved, but Penny does become the face of the search in a big way when she does. You've already hinted to a TV appearance. She does that kind of tragic TV appearance where there's the parent of a missing child pleading for public support and giving a message directly to their missing child, who they, I'm sure, in most cases, hope can hear the news report. Tell me about Penny's television appearance in Plea to Carissa.
So Penny comes in with Vernon, her boyfriend, on one side, and the police on the other, and standing behind her is Paul Boudreau, Karissa's biological dad, and grandmother, Suzanne. And Penny is speaking directly to Karissa in the camera, saying, please come home, please call Nanny, we're all missing you, your friends, please reach out to us. We're so scared. What's happened? I'm not mad about the fight. It was just a fight. So that was her first press conference. Well, 2 days later, she does a second press conference. And again, this one attracts national media attention from all the big stations in Canada and reporters. And she goes on again. And this time she says, Karissa, call anyone. If you don't want to talk to me, call somebody. And in the middle of the press conference, she says, oh, and thank you for everyone who's been out helping, and thank you for the support and money. And so that really rubs people the wrong way. Some people look at that and say, oh, what's going on here?
I'm just here to reach out to my daughter. Karissa, I just want to tell you that you have lots of people who love you and want you home. Your Aunt April is here, your mom is here, your dad, Shane, Vernon, your Uncle Joey, your Aunt Chrissy, your friend Sarah's worried sick, everybody at school, your grandmothers, everybody. Please just reach out to someone. At least call us and let you know you're okay. We all love you. And if there's anybody out there that knows, has seen her or anything, please call. The other thing I want to say is I want to thank everyone in the community that's been a support, all the businesses we both work for, and the community in general. It's been very comforting. Nothing can be done to make things better, but it's comforting to have support. The main thing is I just want somebody to come forward. If not Karissa herself, somebody, let me know. It's hard to not know where your kid is.
Some people were suspicious of Penny, but it seems more so the public was questioning Penny's boyfriend Vernon's role in the story, where I believe he had a complicated legal background leading up to this that made him someone that a lot of people were pointing towards. What was the perception of Vernon from the public at this point?
Vernon is one of the most interesting people in this tragic story because he had mental health issues. He assaulted a police officer. He really, on paper, had a bad record. And so let's face it, it's always the boyfriend. It's never the mom. Mm-hmm. So the community immediately starts suspecting him. And Facebook is around back then, and it's just exploding with rumors about Vernon. So yeah, he definitely was in the sight of line, not just of the community, but of police too. So they bring in both of them and ask them to give official statements. And Vernon, Vernon is nervous because he knows he's got a past, and that's going to come out. So he bends over backwards to say how much he loved Karissa, and how much he misses her, and he's very, very upset and sad about her disappearance, and he has started drinking heavily. So yeah, Vernon was definitely the first suspect. It was getting pretty intense in Bridgewater, because by now we're almost 2 weeks in and she hasn't been found, and so the rumor mill is rampant.
And up until this point, with the exception of one piece of evidence, there had been no sign of Karissa found. The only thing found at this point was one of her Crocs that she was wearing. Tell me the story of how that was found and what that led people to think.
it was so odd. A man was out driving by this kind of farmland dirt road, and on the snowbank from the big storm that had finally been plowed sat one pink croc. And how odd, it was sitting on top of a frozen snowbank. And so he calls police. Well, that is their first break in the case, because then they realize something untoward has happened and something probably awful, versus her running away. And so the pink croc is used as holdback evidence. They ask the gentleman not to tell the public. We're not going to tell the public. We need to hang on to this. We need to do a major search, which they do. They conduct it into the evening, looking for any other evidence of Karissa. But they're very smart. They hold back the evidence, knowing that if something untoward has happened to her, this could be very important. And it proves to be very much so in the future.
Mm-hmm. So at this point in the story that we're discussing, we're very much talking about the search for what's presumed to be a missing person. With the police having holdback evidence, some suspicion being directed towards Karissa's mom, Penny, and her live-in boyfriend, Vernon. It seems like investigators are beginning to expect some a bad outcome for this story, but the story will really take a dramatic turn when a second discovery is made, also completely accidentally. And that discovery is going to be Karissa's remains. Can you tell me how she was found?
It was a fluke of nature, to quote the detective on the case.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he actually took the first morning off. It had been 13 days, and Sergeant Scott Wiener was at home when he got the call. A little boy had needed to go pee. He was driving along the LaHaye riverbank with his mom in the car, and he couldn't hold it any longer. And there's this little spot, they call it the turnaround locally, because it's just big enough to turn a car around if you need to go back the other way. So the boy gets out and he goes through the snow a little bit, over the river, because he's shy. He doesn't want anyone to see him peeing. And the poor guy, he's looking around and he looks down and he sees these what appear to be frozen toes sticking out from the snow. And he screams, "Mom." And mom runs over and she screams too. And they don't know what they're looking at, but they know it's not good. And they flag someone down and they call 911. And within minutes, Sergeant Wiener is there, and the police, RCMP, are there. And sure enough, they look down the bank towards the river, and the forensics go down, and there's a frozen body. And it is not less than 2 kilometers away from Karissa's apartment and Penny's apartment. And it's covered in snow. So once they sweep it off and find it, this story takes on a homicide investigation in which RCMP and the Bridgewater Police join forces.
Mm-hmm. So things have changed dramatically here. And now, if there was any suspicion towards Penny prior to Karissa's body being found, where Karissa's body is found, casts even more suspicion towards Penny, because she had like an odd situation play out there herself, just I think like a day or 2 days before Karissa was found. What connects Penny to this turnaround where they found Karissa?
Well, so her reaction is very unusual. Both her and Vernon. Vernon is devastated, and Vernon is still in their sights a bit, because there's no other eyewitnesses and nobody knows what's happened. But Penny calls in with her aunt and says, "We've got to come in and make a statement." She calls police and says, I need to tell you, I was in that spot just days ago. So the police are intrigued now, and And you can bet there's a lot of people listening to this interview. So Penny's aunt from Ontario, who had flown down, goes into one room. Penny goes into another in the RCMP. And she says that I was in the area because we stopped there on our way to the ocean to take a drive and got stuck in the snow in the very spot where the remains were found. And she said, I just felt you needed to know you might find my tire tracks there. So this is the story that she gives police. And at this point, Penny is still talking, cooperating, and so is Vernon. But yeah, it's very unusual. And as Detective Feener said, the hairs are up by now on the back of me.
But at least this part of the story is true. Like Penny did turn her vehicle around in this spot days before Karissa was found and got stuck in the snow to the point that someone had to like come and help pull her out of there, I believe. And maybe a passing motorist had to like actually intervene to get her vehicle unstuck. And there was a witness to this, so that part, whether she ended up
Yep,
getting stuck there intentionally, it at least actually happened.
it did. It did. Absolutely. But this is where it starts to change the story a little bit. Um, because the police decide that they're the main suspects. They need to look at them closer. They did search the records of any sex offenders. They didn't totally have tunnel vision. I wouldn't say that because they were exploring other potential suspects. Um, but they call them. They're getting calls from the neighbors at this point now, from the Jubilee Road apartment, that they're hearing a lot of things going on in the apartment. And at this point, they call. They decide they're going to try to make an arrest and really be aggressive and charge them and hold them for 24 hours and find out if either of them would confess, because the neighbors have called in and they've got heard these conversations and fights, and Vernon crying and yelling, oh, she killed her daughter. So, you know, it's time to step it up here
Mhm.
and get them in.
Yeah, and you said yourself there that one of the things they did in the investigation was took a look around for other sex offenders living in the area. That's something we should just briefly touch on. Is when Karissa was found, there was a reason to suspect that this may have been like a sexually motivated crime, or something, or was at least her body was displayed to maybe hint towards that. What led to there being a need to investigate sex offenders in the area?
Well, it's a great question. Medical examiner Matt Bose, who I was working with at the time because he's part of the Justice Department,
Hmm.
he went down from Halifax. They knew this was so serious. He drove there um, down to Bridgewater to take a look at the scene. And he described to me later in our interview, and his report talks, which was eventually public, how Karissa was found with her one leg of her jeans down and her Winnie the Pooh underwear down, and almost looked like someone had assaulted the child. Um, on the surface, that's what it looked like. But Dr. Matt Bose says, I think someone's trying to stage this and make it look like a sexual assault. Yeah, and when he finished the autopsy, there was no evidence of a sexual assault.
Wow. Okay.
But the day he finishes the autopsy is very important in this story because to this point, 3 days in, sadly, they had to wait for Karissa to body to unthaw before they could do the autopsy. And the police call in Vernon and Penny and the aunt that's visiting. And they think they're about to hear a status update on whether this body and remains were Karissa. The autopsy has just been completed. In fact, it's Valentine's Day, and the police take them into separate rooms and charge them with the murder of Karissa.
On Valentine's Day.
And in a way, it's interesting because, yeah, Penny had written a lot of love notes around the house for Vernon. We start to see and hear about kind of their relationship. But if they arrest them, then they can get a warrant to search the apartment. So that's what they discover. Dozens of love notes from Penny to Vernon. And notes that are very specific. I don't want you to leave me. I don't want you. I love you. I am the person, of your dreams, that kind of notes. It starts to show them what that relationship was all about.
Mhm. They were initially taken in charge. The search of the home was done that found like the quote unquote love notes that you described, but that wouldn't do the trick. Eventually they are released and the charges don't stick at least at this point. Why was it that they were like, did they not have enough information, or why did it not end here?
Well, for two reasons. This is at the point in the interview when Penny refuses to talk. So
Okay.
up until now, she's been the face of the search. They're trying to put pressure, say, look, we've heard what's going on. We think this. We're at your apartment right now searching. And she says nothing. I want a lawyer. I want a lawyer. And it's true. In the apartment, they find a few traces of blood and they find a few other things, a cord, but nothing that the Crown feels, is enough evidence. There's none of Carissa's clothing from that day. And they have 24 hours. They have to release them. But in the middle of the night, they decide to send in an undercover officer into the cell with Vernon and Penny. Penny doesn't say anything. Penny is quiet the whole time, very little. However, Vernon's more chatty. Vernon is upset and he's telling his cellmate that his girlfriend's daughter's been murdered. And this is what we call, in the police world, the start of a Mr. Big operation.
Yes, a controversial but effective investigation method that we've seen be successful in several major crimes on the east coast of Canada here. But Karissa Boudreau's is perhaps the most high profile effective use of the Mr. Big sting that comes to mind. So they lay the initial seeds of the Mr. Big sting by having, as you said, an undercover officer in the cell with Vernon to just strike up enough of a conversation that a month, weeks down the road, Vernon may remember this guy as the fellow he met at prison that day. So that's kind of where this starts. But tell me about how the RCMP used the Mr. Big sting to get closer to Vernon and then to Penny. So walk me through that.
So you're right. I mean, it started with the introduction of one guy who says, I've got a business. I'll look you up. I'll look you up soon and try to help you out. So this was plan B. This is, after all the publicity and the discovery of Karissa, police now go very quiet. And there's a joint operation being developed with input from seasoned officers out in Vancouver, British Columbia, right across the country, right across Canada. It is controversial. In England, it's forbidden because it's quite deceptive. I mean, they lure people in on the pretense that they're working for the organized crime. And Vernon is identified right away as the weak link.
Mm-hmm.
Because Vernon has a drinking problem, he likes to talk, he's upset. So they send someone to befriend Vernon. When I first heard about this, we hear it on TV, etc. But when you talk to people who participate in this, and I tracked down the undercover agent, it took me a couple of years. But I tracked down the guy who was Vernon's best friend. and there was a bump. So they bump in the liquor store. Hey, I know you. I know you. I got some work for you. I'm gonna, you want to come work with us? I'll introduce you to the boss. And so Undercover Steve is the boss. And for the next 4 months, this man with a ponytail, supposedly from Montreal, drives a nice truck. He befriends Vernon and he gets him doing little tasks, doing little deliveries. He doesn't tell him what's in the packages, but pays him cash. And at this point in his life, Vernon is appreciating it because Penny's upset. She's not working. Vernon's not working. They have no money. Suddenly, Vernon has a job, and he starts to get very close to this new friend of his. Well, behind the scenes, every time they're together, there's warrants that have been issued. Undercover operators are allowed to tap and tape every conversation. And it really is built on trust. So the relationship that Vern builds with Undercover Steve, they go to Dooley's to play pool. They go to fancy restaurants. They start giving them bigger jobs. They start saying, we need you to take these boxes and this shipment to Newfoundland. Can you go out west? Suddenly, think of it. Vernon, the stock boy, is now living his best life, and he's sort of getting back on his feet, but very suspicious of Penny and worried. He starts to have his own suspicions, and he starts confiding in Undercover Steve.
And his trust in Undercover Steve is so strong that Penny and Vernon's lawyer even warns them to be careful of who they let into their life at this point. And I believe it specifically tells Vernon and Penny about the Mr. Big Sting that police can use. Yet that's not enough for him to realize what's happening.
Yeah, so poor Vern. His lawyer calls him ASAP. We need to talk. And he says, I saw this Mr. Big thing on W5 on a news magazine. You better watch out. At this point, Penny is not in the organized crime ring. In fact, it's right around then where Vern says, oh no, I wouldn't be stupid enough to fall for something like that. He tells Steve, he goes, and Steve's getting nervous that the whole thing's going to be blown. And he says, if you think that, you get the fuck out of my truck. Like, if you think, I'm any part of that, I don't even want you near me. And Vern's like, no, I just wanted us to be aware of it. Right? Yeah. So that was a close moment. So it's at this point, though, they start to realize Vern does not have direct evidence, or they don't believe he hurt Karissa. They make that conclusion after about 3 months. So think about how tight you see Steve and Vern are. Like, Vern calls him his best friend. Man, I love you. I'd do anything for you. So Steve says, anything? Well, I think we need a woman on the job. I want you to ask your girlfriend. And Vern's reluctant. No. No, she wouldn't be good for this. She's, no. By now they've moved to Halifax to get away from the media, and she's working at another superstore. But Vern said, Vern sees that his boss, his friend, needs this help, and he says, all right, I'll try. If I do this, will you take care of us? Sure, I always take care of my guys. So Penny, they set up a meeting. They bring in an undercover woman, police officer, and the meeting goes well. And then their sights are set on Penny, and it doesn't take long.
So they convince Penny to join this fake criminal organization to do the same kind of odd jobs that for cash that Vernon had been doing. Up until now, Penny largely kept to herself and wasn't kind of confiding in anyone. But as you said, it doesn't take long. What is Penny's interaction like with Undercover Steve and his pseudo criminal organization?
Well, she thrives. She loves it. And she loves the trip. She goes to Montreal, and she can't get enough of it. And they buy her a cell phone. They give her a new name, Penny Jones. It's very exciting to her. And she's willing to do anything. But then she tells undercover Karen, will call her, she just wish her legal problems would go away. And undercover Karen says, what do you mean your legal problems? And then Penny starts to tell her about her daughter being, missing and murdered, and the police think it's her. And she says to her, I just really wish that I could blow up any DNA or evidence they have. And this is the conversation that'll haunt her forever.
So where does it go from here? So Penny can find, she doesn't say like, I did it. She just says like, my life would be easier and I could better devote myself to working in this criminal organization if that police station and the evidence within it were to blow up and be gone forever. That is like the blood in the water for the investigative sharks that are running this Mr. Big Sting. What do they do with this information?
Well, at that point, they realize, okay, she is getting desperate, and they call it a stim operation. They actually come and they pound on her door, and she doesn't want to answer it. And she's calling Vern, and who's with undercover Steve, and she's rattled. And okay, so nothing happens in the next day or two, but very soon, Vern says, look, Steve, you got to help us. Like, you got to help us with our problem. And Steve says, I'll help you. I'll do anything for you. He's also told them that once this mess is all over, they can move away and they'll get out of the province. They'll get a new house.
Mhm.
He promises them, he counts in front of them thousands of dollars of cash that is going to help them with the down payment on a new house somewhere else. But yeah, they meet in a parking lot, in a coffee shop parking lot. And that is when they say, help make this go away for us, which leads to the ultimate meeting, the final day.
How does that go down?
So at this point, there's about 20 RCMP undercover operators, and the Mr. Big flies in from Vancouver. And Steve says, you're gonna meet the real mob leader, and you're just gonna have to talk to him. I won't even be in the room, but you're gonna have to talk to him, Vern and Penny. So this Mr. Big is very astute, and he knows how to get Penny alone in the room, and Vernon leaves. And it's very hard to talk about the conversation that came out there, but this is where Penny completely opens up and tells Mr. Big exactly what happened on that Sunday afternoon.
Mhm. And it's a lot different than the version she told the public and the investigators leading up to now. So she's sitting with Mr. Big in like a hotel room or whatnot with the idea that I can tell you everything and you're going to deal with it and make it go away. She has complete trust in them, as evidenced by what she goes on to reveal. What is this second version, the much closer to the truth version that we hear from Penny as a result of this complicated Mr. Big Sting?
So undercover Steve is in the next room watching through a video camera. He doesn't even really know what's coming next.
Mhm.
Nobody does. She tells him that her boyfriend Vernon gave her an ultimatum, that it was either me or the child. And so Penny decides she values the relationship with Vernon. And she tells Mr. Big that she did take her daughter for a drive that afternoon. And they did set out to Lunenburg. And they did talk. And things did go poorly. But she's also packed twine in the trunk of the car. And she tells Mr. Big that they did go to the Sobeys. And she corroborates like the drives around town. But instead of going to the parks, she went off the dirt road, the farm road, and Karissa was saying she wanted to get out. So at this point, Karissa is afraid, very afraid of, why are we coming up here? And it's get dark and it's snowing. And Karissa gets out. Her mom comes around and shoves her and knocks her down in the frozen snow and takes out a piece of twine and puts it around her own daughter's neck. And this is hard to retell. Her, her daughter says, "Mommy, don't." Those were her last words. A daughter that is trusting a parent, and yet Penny does strangle her daughter. And now we see that the pink crock that was left in the snowbank came off when she took her daughter and put her in the car. She then drives down to the turnaround spot, and she takes her daughter and she rolls her down the riverbank, and she confesses to Mr. Big that she did pull down the pants and try to make it look like a sexual assault. Penny then leaves. It's dark. There's not many people out. She takes the twine and she puts it in a coffee cup, and she drives to the Tim Hortons and throws it in the garbage. And she takes the vest and the other pink crock and she puts them in a trash can, and she goes home.
Wow. In this, like, with everything you know about this story, this version of the story that we hear from Penny to Mr. Big, how close to the truth, like, do you personally believe this is?
Well, we know a lot of it has to be true because it does align with what the police were able to uncover in terms of the evidence. It does. Only the killer would know the cause of death. That was
Mhm.
never revealed.
Mhm.
It was Penny who said she was strangled, and it was Dr. Matt Bose, who I worked with, who concluded that it was death by strangulation, and that had never been public. We also know that the clothing and the other evidence was deposited in the places that Penny had said she had gone looking for Karissa.
Mhm.
So, I mean, ultimately, Penny is the only one who knows what truly happens. But the fact that she wrote this down on paper, that she confessed, um, and remember, she didn't know she was confessing. She was being
Yes.
videotaped. It's only when they arrested her a week later after the confession on the video, she still maintained her innocence, even though she was now charged again. And it's only when they brought in the tape and played it for her and she saw herself on camera
Mhm.
that she slumped down and cried for the first time, realizing she had been duped.
Mhm.
So we have to assume that that is in part what happened.
Mhm. And
Any, yeah.
yeah, in the Mr. Big sting, like, yes, they filmed her telling the story, but they even went so far as to ask her to write it down. I just, like, when I hear of these Mr. Big stings being successful, I think I'm just amazed that this can happen and that that wouldn't raise red flags in Penny. So they filmed her telling the story. They had her write out a version. Am I right with that?
They had her write out a version, but they also got her to reenact it. So they left the Halifax hotel. Um, Penny, Penny wanted so much, I think, for another life.
Mhm.
Um, it, undercover Steve threw up when he heard this in the next room. He was equally disturbed. Like, he says it was just pure evil what he heard her saying. She does get in the car. She goes down to show them because Mr. Big says, "Well, I need to make sure we know everything so we can take care of the whole problem."
Mhm.
She takes them to the site. She takes them to the spots. She's very explicit in showing Mr. Big what happened. And then at the end, he says, "We need one more thing from you." I mean, these RCMP have been doing this for years and years. Up to this point, they've done 350 Mr. Big operations in Canada. And he asks her for a piece of clothing just to so that he can get rid of it in case there's any evidence. And she goes and gives him her winter coat that she was wearing that day.
It's amazing. And according to her, Penny's version that she gives Mr. Big, Vernon was not aware of what she was doing. I believe she even went so far as to say, like, I don't want Vernon to know about this. This is, between us. So it seems like Vernon is not involved. In her motivation is supported by the things she said, but also those kind of obsessive love notes that you described. It's very clear that the relationship as she saw it with Vernon was her number one priority, her number two and number three priorities as well. So I think that seems appropriate. That seems fair to say.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's what makes it so even sadder. And in all the interviews for the book and all the, there's an aunt that spent many hours with me, um, so hurt because Penny had choices. There were many people, as we talk about in Carissa's life, who would have taken her. And, that her daughter was an inconvenience to her, that she would go to such lengths, um, just makes it even more tragic and unnecessary.
And the story, as we hear, Penny had twine in her, or rope or whatever, in the trunk of her car, either by coincidence or by plan. Initially, there's enough evidence to charge her with first degree murder, which would involve some sort of premeditation, but that's not what she eventually gets stuck with. What leads to her instead being convicted of second degree murder? We tell that story.
Sure. So the Crown, not only do they have the confession on tape,
Mhm.
they also have the premeditated fact that she made those phone calls ahead
Mm.
and planted an out, her version and out, of what happened.
That's right,
So
because when she's in the grocery store
yeah,
in Sobeys, the initial version is that Carissa got out of the car and took off from there,
yeah,
but in reality, Carissa was
yeah,
was killed after
yeah.
that.
Yeah. And so, they feel that is premeditation. She also, they think, picked this particular day because it was a snowstorm.
Mm.
So the Crown feels very confident that they could get first degree murder, but in situations as horrible as this, they want to try to spare the family a trial, and they consult the family, and they do their research, and they actually do the pros and cons. They're very they're very sure that they can get first, but is it worth it? Two mitigating factors, I think. One was, if we get her to agree to plead guilty and take second degree, can we get a long sentence? And they do negotiate and talk with the defense about a 20-year sentence, which is one of the longest that you can get in second degree. And they go back and chat with talk to the family, and decide that this is the best way to go. I also think one of the factors was they didn't have to play the video, which trust me, they it's very, I can imagine watching that, and having that out in the public for two reasons: traumatizing for the entire family, and also it shows the ins and outs of the Mr. Big operation very clearly.
Oh, yes.
Back in 2008, it's a controversial, operation. So, I mean, no one has ever seen that except for the police. Um, and so, yes, they agree to a statement of facts, and that's how we know, and that's the research I started with. What did she agree was a statement of fact? And that does make the proceedings happen fairly quickly. that January morning when people thought a trial was starting, and instead it was a guilty plea.
Mm-hmm.
So she is sentenced right away that morning to 20 years without life, or life sentence with 20 years without parole. And in the end, they got justice for Karissa, because Penny could have got away with murder. She almost did.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the RCMP, very challenging for me to work with, they would say almost nothing. And fortunately, through court filings, etc., I was able to get the warrants, ITOs, and I did find undercover Steve to validate everything, and interviewed him many times. They were successful, and I'm not sure Penny would have ever been caught without it.
The story of Penny and Karissa largely is completed at this point in our discussion, but there has been some updates recently. But Penny Boudreau was in the news. I think I'm thinking back about a year or so for getting kind of I don't think it was a reduced sentence, but increased privilege in prison. What is her present situation now?
So you're right. In the Canadian justice system, if while you're serving your sentence and you're complying with all the rules, etc., you are sort of moved from maximum to medium to minimum security. She is still in a jail for women here in Nova Scotia, about an hour away from Halifax and Truro. She's living in a minimum security situation where, they share a kitchen and they do their own laundry. You can walk around on the grounds freely. And she has 15 years of her sentence is up. But you did hear about her successfully being granted, which has really upset the family and the community, because they didn't know, temporary escort passes of 4 hours, 4 times a year to go to church. And she used those, and then she gained more passes. And more recently, she was granted for the 3rd time increased privileges to go visit a friend while being escorted by a correctional officer. So that is the system based on behavior and rehabilitation back into community. It really has stirred things up again. I mean, for obvious reasons, people felt, including Paul, her biological dad, when these were first being granted, he thought a life sentence meant at least 20 years. But based on good behavior, this is what's happened. And now, as of today, this week, June 15th, Penny has the option for the next 3 months until September to apply for the faint hope clause, which in Canada has been abolished, but it was only abolished in 2011. And so the single act of murder she confessed to committing and was sentenced for happened in 2008. So she could apply to a judge to have a hearing and see if she could have her parole date moved ahead. Wow. That's where we are today.
I want to get into some of your research on the book and some of the reactions to it, but I just have to ask right off the bat, you mentioned how many people you spoke with that were close to this story. Did you have any communication with Penny? I assume you at least reached out.
I did. Initially, I wrote letters to Penny in jail, and they went unreturned. She didn't write me back. Then I went through the correctional services formal process and pretty well laid out that I had interviewed family members, friends, some of Penny's friends I interviewed, childhood friends. So I was very upfront about the book, and would she give me an interview or would she submit a statement, and she declined. And Penny Boudreau has never given an interview. The only interview she ever gave was to the Mr. Big, and she did not know that was being taped. That is the only time she's talked about it.
Wow. So your book comes out, Mommy Don't. It's full of, for even myself as someone who followed this story, your book is full of a lot of new details and inside information and firsthand quotes from people that are, right in the middle of this story. When you release this, what has the reaction been? Like people in Bridgewater who are seeing this clear of a version of the story being told for the first time. What has the response been?
Um, Definitely, it's emotional, and I have gone to Bridgewater um, area for two different signings. Tons of people showing up, wanting to talk about it. Some people are very. I don't. The Aunt Chastity says it's comforting to see the whole thing, maybe a little therapeutic. But most of all, it really is being seen, hopefully, as a tribute to Karissa. And the town put themselves into this, search for this child so much,
Mhm.
and felt so duped. I think I think some people really appreciate that. We'll never forget it. There are those, however, where it's just too emotional and traumatic to even um, they can't even buy the book. It has taken off right across Canada, and I think that's because it's so rare. There are cases in the US that make headlines that where filicide, a mother killing her daughter or her children. It's, no, they've had a very hard time, the Crown, at even finding a similar case in the court
Mhm.
case law. So I think it's because people are intrigued by Mr. Big, and they're also, just appalled that a mother would do this.
Mhm. Uh, Carissa has come to be known, and I've seen her referred to as like Bridgewater's daughter or Bridgewater's girl. How was she seen in the community, and why do you think it is that the community has, I don't know if the word would be embraced her, but have connected her to them in such a way?
Well, I interviewed one woman who had never met Carissa. Her name is Nadine Sardi, and she is a big local community volunteer. And to me, she exemplifies what happened there. She felt guilt somehow that their safe small town didn't see anything, couldn't protect this child. It's a mixture of grief and guilt that this child wasn't safe in their town, and also that she was a member of their community. Um, and so it's tragic for them. They even, she said they even felt bad that they drove by the site for weeks without finding her.
Yeah.
Um, they searched for her. They wrote poems about her. One of them is called Bridgewater's Daughter. There are even songs written about Carissa. Rick Spinney, who heard about it, and he was so moved, that he came to one of the vigils and the anniversaries for Carissa. So it really, it's the loss of innocence too, I think, of a small Canadian town.
Mhm. I can understand that. Now, for people like in our discussion here, we just scratched the surface of the story. There's so much more to it than we would have time to get into on a podcast, but you do have enough time in a book. And I will say, I told you this before we hit record here. I don't recall ever reading a book as fast as I read Mommy Don't. I sat on the couch and I just couldn't get up. I went through it in I think a 5 hour and a 2 hour sitting. And again, this is a story I knew, but I was learning so much and seeing it so well organized and so clear in the book that it's such an amazing telling of it. So anyone who's has any interest in the story, I couldn't recommend the book more. Where do people find it who want to hear the rest of the story?
I really appreciate that. This is my first book,
Hmm.
and I really, tried to share as much as I could. So thank you for saying that. Um, you can support your local bookstore, which would be your Chapters, your Coles, or Nimbus Publishing. You can order directly. The first run is actually sold out, but there's a second print happening, and it's on Amazon. The Amazon sales have been very high, from what I understand, in both Canada and the US. So. And if you want to learn more, I do have a website, sherriaikenhead.com. If anyone wants to reach out and feels like they just want to talk about it once they've read it, definitely, please do. It's a hard story to tell, and it sure was a hard story to write. I didn't set out to write a true crime book. I set out to write Karissa's story, and I'm glad I did.
I want to thank you for joining Sherri and I for this episode of Nighttime. During our conversation, we only scratched the surface of the Penny and Karissa Boudreau story. If you want to know the rest, I can't recommend Sherri's book more. You can find Mommy Don't wherever good books are sold. Now, I'm going to start wrapping up this episode, but before we part, I'm going to end with some thanks. First, a big thanks to Sherri for sharing an evening with me and with you, the listeners of Nighttime. A big thanks to Monty Data, who contributes to the music for this episode. A shout out to LJ from the Dystopian Simulation podcast, who provides my intro and outro voiceovers. And lastly, but most importantly, a massive thank you to each and every one of you listening to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to the premium feed. Lindsay, Merritt, and Katie, thank you for going premium. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show, you can help us out in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs only a couple dollars a month and both funds the creation of the show while giving you the episodes 2 days early, giving them to you ad-free, and giving you access to a full back catalog of episodes. If that sounds good, you can go premium at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. And if for whatever reason you don't want to go premium but still want to support the show, you can give us a big hand by simply sharing this episode on social media and letting like-minded friends know what we're doing here. If you have any story ideas, want to give feedback on the show, or would like to contribute a question or comment to be aired and responded to in an upcoming episode, you can do all that and more at nighttimepodcast.com. Now, I hope to hear from you, but until then, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte.